My husband and his secretary posted couples rings, and I commented, "You make a great pair." Chapter 1: A Birthday Forgotten. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. It was my birthday, but there were no cards, no flowers, and certainly no calls from Leo. The morning had come and gone in muted stillness, and as the evening crept in, I found myself sitting alone at the dining table. A small cake, decorated with pastel frosting, sat untouched before me, its candle unlit. I had bought it myself earlier that day, a quiet acknowledgement of the occasion. As I scrolled through my phone in a feeble attempt to distract myself, a notification popped up. It was a post from Leo. For a brief, foolish moment, my heart quickened, thinking he might have remembered. But when I opened it, my stomach sank. There he was, smiling alongside Elise Parker, his secretary. They were wearing matching rings, the caption reading, "Work partners are also life partners." The caption stung, but not as much as the audacity of the display. For years, I had endured the whispers and side glances, pretending not to notice the growing bond between them. But this was different. This was public, brazen, a declaration that I was irrelevant in his life. My initial reaction was a fleeting pang of hurt, followed by an unfamiliar calm. I typed my response with surprising steadiness, a perfect match. It wasn't an attempt to provoke or gain attention. It was the truth, at least, that's how I saw it now. If Leo and Elise thought so little of me, they deserved each other. No sooner had I posted the comment than my phone began to ring. Leo's voice was sharp and accusatory, laced with the fury of a man whose fragile ego had been pricked. "What are you thinking, posting something like that? Are you out of your mind?" he barked. His anger no longer triggered the fear or guilt it once did. Instead, I listened with a detached curiosity. Before he hung up, I heard him turn to Elise, his tone softening. "Don't cry," he murmured. "She's just being dramatic." I placed my phone down and stared at the untouched cake. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for years began to lift, replaced by a liberating sense of clarity. I didn't feel anger or sadness, only a resolute calm. I realized, in that moment, how little I had been to Leo, and how much more I could be to myself. The woman who would have screamed, cried, and demanded answers was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who had grown tired of fighting for scraps of love and respect. That night, I lit the single candle on my cake, made a wish not for Leo to change, but for myself. I blew it out with a quiet promise: this would be the last time I let him ruin a day meant to celebrate me. Chapter 2: The Calm After the Storm. The morning after my birthday felt different, lighter somehow. The air seemed fresher, the sunlight warmer, though nothing tangible had changed. Leo had left early for work, as he always did, without so much as a word to me. I didn't mind. For the first time in years, his absence wasn't a source of pain. I spent the day tending to myself, a long bath, a walk in the park, and a quiet lunch at my favorite cafe. Each small act felt like a reclamation of something I had lost in the years I spent orbiting Leo's world. As I sat by the window, watching people go by, I wondered why I had let him consume me for so long. The memories came unbidden, pulling me back to the early days of our relationship. Leo had been charming then, attentive, thoughtful, and full of promises. He made me feel special in a way I had never experienced before, and I fell for him with a naivety that now felt almost laughable. Over time, the charm wore thin. His focus shifted elsewhere, first to his work, then to Elise, though I convinced myself otherwise for years. I had spent so much energy chasing his approval, bending over backward to make him happy, that I hadn't noticed how deeply I had buried my own needs. It was only now, in the quiet aftermath of his latest betrayal, that I could see it clearly. In the past, Leo's actions would have devastated me. I would have stormed into his office, confronting him and Elise in a humiliating display of jealousy and hurt. But the thought didn't even cross my mind this time. Instead, I felt an odd sense of relief. His post with Elise, his angry phone call, it had confirmed what I had suspected all along. I was no longer a priority to him, if I ever had been. Accepting that truth was strangely freeing. I didn't need to fight for someone who had already chosen to leave me behind. That evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from one of my friends. Saw Leo's post. "You okay?" it read. I stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "I'm fine." More than fine, actually. And I meant it. For years, I had clung to the hope that Leo would change, that he would see my worth and fight for me. But now, I understood that I didn't need him to. I could fight for myself. Chapter 3: Taking the First Step. The days that followed were a blur of quiet determination. Leo was so absorbed in his work and Elise that he barely noticed my newfound distance. He left for the office before I woke and returned home long after I had gone to bed. For once, his neglect felt like a blessing. It gave me the space to think, to plan. Sitting at the kitchen counter one morning, I made a call that had been years in the making. The lawyer's voice on the other end was professional, calm, and reassuring as we discussed the terms of my prenuptial agreement. It was a conversation that, months ago, I would have feared. Now, it felt empowering. I found myself sorting through the remnants of my life with Leo, photos, trinkets, and gifts that once felt like treasures but now seemed meaningless. With each item I boxed away, I felt lighter, as though I were shedding the weight of a past that no longer served me. The memories attached to those things were bittersweet, but they no longer held power over me. It wasn't about erasing Leo or pretending our years together hadn't happened, it was about reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given up along the way. At work, I began to notice how much of myself I had neglected outside of my marriage. My colleagues seemed to notice too. "You look different lately," one of them said over lunch. "Happier." I smiled, realizing it was true. For years, I had tied my identity to being Leo's wife, but now I was rediscovering who I was beyond that role. The world felt brighter, more expansive, as though I were seeing it clearly for the first time. Leo, meanwhile, was oblivious to the shift. He continued his charade with Elise, posting photos and sharing inside jokes that once would have made my blood boil. Now, I barely gave them a second thought. His indifference, once so painful, had become my liberation. I no longer needed his validation, his affection, or his approval. The thought was exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt free. Chapter 4: A Test of Resolve. It wasn't long before Leo began to sense the shift, though he couldn't pinpoint its cause. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a book, he walked in earlier than usual. His tie was loosened, and his expression carried a mix of irritation and curiosity. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked, his voice probing. I looked up from my book, meeting his gaze with an expression of calm indifference. "Have I?" I replied, the faintest trace of a smile playing on my lips. His brow furrowed as though expecting me to lash out or demand answers about Elise. Instead, I simply returned to my reading, leaving him standing there, unbalanced and confused. In the past, his attempts to provoke me into confrontation would have succeeded. I would have begged for his attention, argued over the blatant disrespect, and cried myself to sleep. But now, his efforts fell flat. He didn't know how to handle my newfound composure, and that unsettled him. Over the next few days, he began to linger more, asking trivial questions about my day, trying to bait me into conversation. I answered politely but without the eagerness he was used to. Each interaction only solidified my resolve. The real test came one weekend, when Leo suggested we attend a charity gala together. I almost laughed at the irony. He had spent years finding excuses to exclude me from events, and now, when I was on the brink of leaving, he wanted to parade me around as his wife. "Sure," I said lightly, as if the decision held no significance. His surprise was evident, but he didn't question it. That night, I wore a sleek black gown, simple yet elegant, paired with a quiet confidence that made me feel radiant. At the gala, Leo tried to reclaim his usual role as the charming husband, introducing me to colleagues and pretending we were a picture-perfect couple. But I noticed the subtle glances between him and Elise, the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought no one was watching. It should have hurt, but instead, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Leo's world, so meticulously constructed, was beginning to crack. And I would no longer be the glue holding it together. Chapter 5: Shifting the Balance. A week after the gala, I made my next move. I visited a financial advisor, someone recommended by my lawyer. As we went over my assets and plans for the future, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. For years, I had let Leo control every aspect of our life, from our finances to our social calendar. Now, I was taking the reins, building a foundation that would support me when I finally walked away. The advisor was professional and efficient, explaining each step with clarity. By the end of the meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. At home, Leo began to act differently. He was no longer as dismissive or aloof. He would hover around the edges of my space, asking questions that seemed designed to test my mood. "Everything okay with work?" he asked one evening, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Everything's fine," I replied with a serene smile. His unease was palpable. The dynamic between us had shifted, and he didn't know how to navigate it. For once, I held the power, and I wasn't about to let it go. Elise, too, seemed to notice the change. At a company event, she approached me with a sugary smile that barely masked her discomfort. "You and Leo seem closer lately," she remarked, her tone carefully neutral. I met her gaze, unflinching. "Do we?" I said, my voice calm and unbothered. The color drained from her face as I turned away, leaving her to stew in her uncertainty. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to her presence. Instead, I was setting the terms. Each step I took toward reclaiming my independence felt like a small victory. I wasn't just planning my escape, I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece. Leo could sense it, Elise could sense it, and I reveled in the subtle power of their unease. They had expected me to remain the same, to cling to the scraps they offered. But I was done playing the role they had written for me. This was my story now, and I was determined to write an ending that was mine alone. Chapter 6: The Beginning of the End. As the weeks passed, I finalized my plans with quiet determination. Each step was carefully calculated, from updating my will to securing a new apartment on the other side of the city. Leo remained oblivious, consumed by his work and whatever fantasies he shared with Elise. I didn't care anymore. His neglect, which once felt like a dagger to my heart, had become my shield. It gave me the freedom to build my escape without interference. One evening, Leo returned home earlier than usual, his tie undone and his face shadowed with fatigue. "Let's have dinner together," he said, his voice unusually soft. I hesitated, not because I wanted his company, but because this rare gesture of consideration caught me off guard. "All right," I replied, hiding my surprise. Over the meal, he made an effort to ask about my day, my work, even my hobbies, questions he hadn't bothered with in years. It was almost laughable, this sudden attempt at civility. But I played along, answering his questions with polite disinterest. Inside, I knew what this was: guilt. He must have noticed the distance growing between us, and this was his feeble attempt to bridge it. Yet he didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the years of emotional neglect or the blatant betrayal with Elise. Instead, he seemed to believe that a few pleasant dinners could erase the past. It only solidified my resolve. Leo might sense that something was changing, but he had no idea how much power I had regained. After dinner, as Leo lingered at the table, I excused myself and went upstairs. In the privacy of my room, I reviewed my plans one last time. My lawyer had set a court date, and the financial advisor assured me I would leave the marriage with enough to start fresh. The thought was exhilarating. Soon, I would be free from Leo's indifference, from the shadow of Elise, from the suffocating role of the neglected wife. My future was no longer tied to him, and I felt more alive than I had in years. Chapter 7: The Confrontation. The morning of the court date dawned crisp and clear, as if the world itself was cheering me on. I left the house before Leo woke, my suitcase already packed and waiting in the trunk of my car. The drive to the courthouse was serene, the quiet hum of the engine matching the calm that had settled in my chest. For so long, I had feared this moment, but now, I welcomed it. This wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. Leo's reaction was as dramatic as I had expected. He stormed into the courthouse, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're divorcing me?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the hallway. "After everything I've done for you?" I turned to him, my expression calm but resolute. "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated, my voice steady. "Like neglecting me for years? Like flaunting your relationship with Elise in front of the world?" His face reddened, but he said nothing, his anger rendered impotent by the truth of my words. During the hearing, Leo's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a perfect husband and an unreasonable wife. But the evidence was clear: photos, messages, even his public posts with Elise. The judge barely needed convincing. By the end of the day, the divorce was finalized, and I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I ever had. Leo called after me, his voice tinged with desperation. "This isn't over, Evelyn. We can fix this." I paused, turning back to face him. "No, Leo," I said, my voice firm. "You had years to fix this. And you chose not to." I left without looking back. My new apartment awaited, a blank canvas for the life I was ready to create. For the first time in years, I was free. Free to live, to grow, to love myself in a way Leo never could. I had spent so long fighting for his attention, his affection, his approval. But now, I understood that I didn't need any of it. The only person I needed to fight for was me. Chapter 8: Rediscovering Myself. The first night in my new apartment felt surreal. The space was small but warm, with sunlight streaming through the large windows, casting golden patterns on the hardwood floors. As I unpacked, I realized how little of my past life I had brought with me. Just a few books, some clothes, and a handful of sentimental items I couldn't bear to part with. Everything else, the furniture, the gifts, the reminders of Leo, had been left behind. This wasn't just a new home, it was a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into building a life that was truly my own. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned long ago: painting, hiking, even yoga. Each new experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had lost during my marriage. I met new people through work and community events, forming friendships that weren't tied to Leo or the life we had built together. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, unburdened by the weight of someone else's expectations. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, I ran into an old college friend, Daniel. He was just as I remembered: kind, thoughtful, with a quick wit that always made me laugh. Over coffee, we caught up on each other's lives. He told me about his travels, his work, and his recent move back to the city. I shared pieces of my journey, omitting the details about Leo and Elise. It felt good to talk to someone who knew me before the chaos of my marriage. As we parted ways, Daniel asked if we could meet again. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready for anything more than friendship. But as I looked at him, with his warm smile and genuine interest in my life, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I deserved to explore the possibility of happiness again. "I'd like that," I said, feeling a spark of hope I hadn't felt in years. Chapter 9: Leo's Descent. While I was rebuilding my life, Leo's world was beginning to crumble. Elise, it turned out, wasn't as loyal as he had believed. Word spread quickly that she had left the company and was now dating a wealthy client. Leo's perfect facade was shattered, leaving him angry and humiliated. He began calling me late at night, his voice a mixture of regret and desperation. "Evelyn, I made a mistake," he said during one call. I need you back. I listened calmly, my emotions surprisingly unaffected. Leo, I replied, my voice firm, I gave you years to care about me, to treat me like your wife. You chose Elise instead. You don't miss me, you miss the idea of someone tolerating your behavior. His silence spoke volumes. For once, he had no rebuttal, no excuses. He tried to argue, but I hung up before he could finish. I had no intention of letting him drag me back into his mess. His attempts to contact me became more desperate over time. He sent flowers, handwritten letters, even showed up at my new apartment one evening. I stood in the doorway, blocking his entrance. What do you want, Leo? I asked, my tone cold. To apologize, he said, his voice cracking. I was a fool, Evelyn. I let the wrong person into my life and pushed the right one away. I shook my head, unmoved. You didn't just push me away, Leo. You destroyed what we had. There's nothing left to fix. Watching him walk away, defeated, felt like closure. For years, I had sought his approval, his love, his attention. But now, I realized that his regret didn't matter. It wouldn't change the past, and it wouldn't dictate my future. The life I was building didn't need Leo in it. For the first time, I was free from his shadow, and it was a freedom I wasn't willing to give up. Chapter 10: New Horizons. My days with Daniel were like breathing fresh air after being submerged underwater for years. He didn't just listen, he truly heard me. Our conversations weren't superficial exchanges of pleasantries, they were deep, meaningful, and unforced. He was patient, never prying into my past, allowing me to share only what I felt ready to. It was a stark contrast to the hollow conversations I had grown accustomed to during my marriage. One evening, Daniel invited me to a gallery showcasing local artists. As I walked through the vibrant displays, I felt a twinge of inspiration I hadn't felt in years. The paintings spoke of resilience, loss, and hope, emotions that mirrored my own journey. Do you ever think about painting again? Daniel asked softly, noticing how I lingered before a particular piece. I nodded, surprised by how the thought thrilled me. I used to love it, I admitted, but I haven't picked up a brush in years. His encouragement was simple but profound, maybe it's time. Over the next few weeks, I began to paint again. At first, it was frustrating, my hands felt clumsy, and my strokes were uncertain. But gradually, I found my rhythm. The blank canvas became a sanctuary, a place where I could pour out my emotions without fear of judgment. Daniel would occasionally stop by to see my progress, always offering words of encouragement without intruding. His support reminded me of what real partnership looked like: mutual respect, space, and understanding. For the first time, I began to envision a future untainted by my past. I could see myself thriving as an artist, perhaps even hosting my own exhibition one day. And while Daniel was quickly becoming an important part of my life, I knew my happiness no longer depended on anyone else. I was learning to stand on my own, and the strength I found in that independence was exhilarating. Chapter 11: Leo's Obsession. While I was rediscovering myself, Leo's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His calls became more frequent, each one more desperate than the last. He begged for forgiveness, claiming he had changed. "Evelyn, I can't live without you," he said during one late-night call. His voice was filled with an anguish that might have moved me once, but now, it only filled me with pity. When he showed up at my workplace uninvited, my patience finally snapped. "You need to stop this, Leo," I said firmly, leading him away from my colleague's curious eyes. "We're done. You need to accept that." His expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw the man he had always been: entitled, selfish, and unwilling to accept responsibility. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice low. "We belong together." "Belong together?" I repeated, incredulous. "You didn't think we belonged together when you were parading Elise around, did you?" My words struck him like a blow, and for the first time, he looked genuinely defeated. I was a fool, he murmured, his gaze dropping to the floor. But his regret wasn't my responsibility anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the lobby. Later that evening, Daniel noticed my troubled mood. Over dinner, I confided in him about Leo's escalating attempts to reconcile. He listened carefully, his brow furrowing with concern. "Do you feel safe?" he asked, his voice steady but serious. The question gave me pause. For all Leo's flaws, I didn't think he would ever harm me. But the intensity of his obsession was unsettling. "I'm not afraid of him," I replied, "but I don't think he's ready to let go." Chapter 12: A Step Toward the Future. Leo's persistence eventually led me to seek legal action. With the help of my lawyer, I filed for a restraining order, making it clear that I wouldn't tolerate any further intrusion into my life. When he was served the papers, I braced myself for backlash, but instead, there was silence. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. During this time, my relationship with Daniel deepened. He never rushed me, never pressured me to define what we were. Instead, he focused on supporting me as I rebuilt my life. One evening, as we walked along the riverbank, he stopped abruptly, turning to face me. "Evelyn," he began, his voice hesitant, "I need you to know that I care about you deeply. But I'll wait for as long as you need. There's no rush." His words brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I had been in relationships defined by urgency and chaos. This was different, steady, kind, and unwavering. "Thank you," I said softly, taking his hand in mine. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a step forward, a promise of something more. In the weeks that followed, my painting gained recognition. A local gallery invited me to showcase my work, and the opening night was a resounding success. As I stood before my pieces, surrounded by friends and supporters, I realized how far I had come. My life was no longer defined by Leo's betrayal or Elisa's presence. It was my own, filled with hope, passion, and the promise of a brighter future. Chapter 13: Leo's Last Plea. The peace I had found was shattered one afternoon when I received a letter. It wasn't typed or sent electronically, it was handwritten, delivered to my gallery. As I unfolded the paper, I recognized Leo's familiar scrawl. His words were heavy with remorse, recounting memories of our early days together and admitting his mistakes. He wrote about the emptiness that consumed him since I left, claiming that losing me had made him realize what he truly valued. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, nostalgia, maybe even pity. But as I read further, his words felt less like an apology and more like a desperate attempt to pull me back into his orbit. The man who had once dismissed me, belittled me, and chosen someone else over me was now asking for forgiveness and another chance. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer without a second thought. The chapter of my life with Leo had ended, and no amount of regret on his part could change that. A few days later, Leo appeared at the gallery during my closing hours. "Evelyn, please," he started, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "Just hear me out." I stood my ground, keeping the counter between us. "Leo, we've had this conversation. There's nothing left to say." He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said, almost as if it were a badge of honor. "I'm changing, Evelyn. I'm trying." For the first time, I felt a strange sense of closure. He wasn't the same arrogant man I once knew, but it was too late for me to care. "I'm glad you're taking steps to better yourself," I replied honestly. "But your journey is yours, Leo. It doesn't include me anymore." My words were final, and after a long, defeated look, he nodded and left. Chapter 14: The Brightest Dawn. With Leo finally out of my life, I allowed myself to fully embrace the present. The gallery became a second home, a place where I could express myself freely and connect with others who shared my love for art. Daniel was by my side every step of the way, his quiet encouragement giving me strength. One evening, after a particularly successful exhibit, Daniel invited me to celebrate at a cozy rooftop restaurant. As the sun set over the city, painting the skyline in hues of orange and pink, he turned to me with a rare nervousness. "Evelyn," he began, his voice soft but steady, "you've shown me what it means to rebuild, to grow, and to find beauty in brokenness. I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know how much I love you." His confession took my breath away. For a long moment, I was silent, not because I doubted his feelings, but because I was overwhelmed by my own. "Daniel," I finally said, my voice thick with emotion, "I didn't think I could feel this way again. But with you, it's different. It's safe. It's real. I love you too." As the city lights began to twinkle below us, Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in his. There was no grand declaration or dramatic gesture, just a quiet moment of shared understanding and affection. It was the beginning of something beautiful, built on trust, respect, and the lessons we had both learned from our pasts. Chapter 15: The Art of Moving Forward. Months later, as I prepared for my largest exhibition yet, I reflected on how far I had come. My life was no longer a shadow of what it had been with Leo, it was something entirely new, shaped by resilience and the courage to let go. The pieces in my exhibition told my story, not just of heartbreak, but of healing, growth, and rediscovery. On opening night, the gallery buzzed with excitement. Friends, colleagues, and strangers admired the paintings, each one a piece of my journey. Daniel stood beside me, his pride evident in his warm smile. "You've created something extraordinary," he whispered, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the art. Leo made an appearance that night, though I hadn't expected him to. He approached me cautiously, keeping his distance as he offered a polite congratulations. "You've done well, Evelyn," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place, regret, perhaps, or acceptance. "Thank you," I replied simply. There was no animosity left, only a quiet acknowledgement of what once was. As the night drew to a close, I stood before my favorite painting, a vibrant, swirling piece titled Resurgence. It captured everything I had felt over the past year: pain, hope, and the strength to rise again. Daniel joined me, slipping an arm around my waist. "This is just the beginning," he said, and for the first time, I truly believed it.